our best to answer those questions, your questions. And we've pulled together some of our favorite experts to help us out. Joining me now are Rachel Bitecofer, founder and editor of The Cycle and senior advisor to the Lincoln Project, Dave Wasserman, House editor for the Cook Political Report, and LaTosha Brown, co-founder of Black Voters Matter. And now let's get to the questions. Okay, first up, and this is from Terry Snow, who's worried about voting. And she writes, millions of mail-in ballots have not been returned, and some say we can't rely on the Postal Service with a week to go. What's the best strategy for getting your vote counted for those who still have their ballots? LaTosha, I'm going to throw that to you because I know you're on a tour talking to voters. What's the best way to make sure your votes count, and should people rely on the mail?
You know, if people have not voted by this time, it's 6 days out, I would suggest that they go vote in person. It's late to really be able to mail in your ballot, but if you've already mailed in your ballot, you can actually, there are a lot of apps that are on now that you can track your ballot as a ballot tracker. I would even encourage them, they can go to our website, Black Voters Matter fund.org/vote, and they can actually get connected to an app that they can track their ballot to make sure that their ballot has gone in, particularly if the state is tracking that ballot.
And really quickly to stay with you, LaTosha, here's a question from Jen Chim. And she says, are the lines that we're seeing for early voting due to voter enthusiasm, or do some districts simply not have enough polling places? She says, I'm from a small town, and the lines in cities in Pennsylvania, Georgia, Texas, et cetera, are intimidating.
I think it's a combination of both. What we're seeing right now is a compounded issue that is related to voter suppression over time. We've seen the massive closing of polling sites since 2013 in many of these cities. We've actually seen a Secretary of State literally be able to drop people from the voting rolls that many people have had to re-register this year. But we also, so I think there's a combination where people are determined. What I think that has happened this year is that with all that is happening, unraveling around voter suppression, unraveling of the Postal Service, the voters that we are talking to are teed off, that they are determined that nothing is going to stop their voting. So I think that there's some people that are voting because they are determined that their vote is going to count and their voice is going to count. But I also think that we're seeing the long lines because there has been a concerted effort over time to really be able to restrict access to people voting and not anticipating that people will come out in the numbers that we're seeing this year.
All right, let's go to the doc. Rachel Bitecofer, this is a question from Del Mack. And the question is, how are mail-in ballots counted, by hand or machine? Is every state different? Do we know the number of mail-in ballots received versus the number of in-person votes?
Yeah, this is a really complex question, and that's because our electoral system is completely decentralized. So we have a 50-state system, 50 states running a totally different system. And, you know, when you go in and vote, some places it may not be this way, but many states use those electronic voting machines. That's not the case with an absentee or a mail-in ballot. It's going to be a paper ballot. So those do have to be hand counted. And that is why we are anticipating a very slow count, especially from the states that are, you know, what I would call emergency expansion states. They expanded mail voting. They might have had the Skeletor frames of it, like Pennsylvania had, I think, 5% of its electorate using mail voting previous to this cycle. So they had some infrastructure for it, but certainly nothing to process, you know, millions of ballots, right?
Yeah.
But, you know, to answer that question, it varies a lot, but in general, when it comes in through the mail, it's going to be a hand-marked paper ballot, which is nice because there's a paper trail. The downside, of course, is that it leaves the voter vulnerable to making mistakes that can cause their ballot to be disqualified. So you did send in a paper ballot, you always want to check and make sure your vote has been counted, and that if there is an issue with your ballot, you do have time to rectify those issues. If you catch it, some states do notify voters. Not all states. Obviously, it's going to be contingent on whether you're in a voter-friendly state, AKA a blue state or a red state. Yeah. So do check in if you sent in a ballot. As LaTosha pointed out, you can track your ballot, do that, make sure your vote counted.
And just to do a little sidebar for our audience, we did get this decision that the Supreme Court has not allowed Pennsylvania Republicans to just automatically stop counting the votes of mail-in ballots that come in after Election Day. Amy Coney Barrett actually stood down and did not vote on that, so that did not go through. And just for those of you who live in Pennsylvania, let's just make sure you guys understand that that means the justices are not going to consider this before the election. And so if oh, go on.
Joy, I just have to point out, they left a major loophole. They left a major loophole that says they have reserved the right to reconsider whether they will take the case before so they may take the case still. And I just think people really need to know that they may still decide to hear that case in Pennsylvania.
And but the only difference is they're not going to hear it before the election. So what's going to happen to your vote if you mail it in and it gets there, it's postmarked before, but it gets there after the election, those ballots are going to be counted, but they're going to be set aside for, as Rachel said, a potential later case that could still go to the Supreme Court. So just don't mail it in.
Best bet is,
Don't mail it in.
Physically in.
Bring it in. Bring it in. All right, let's get Dave in here. Dave, I'm going to send you a question from Malka. And Malka asks, does polling take into account a rejected ballot, voters who were deregistered, et cetera? Do these count as registered or likely voters because they were rejected and they intended to vote? Do they count as having voted if they sent a ballot that was rejected? And that means somebody who maybe didn't put the right signature, or maybe they had to vote provisionally for some reason. Do those votes generally get counted?
It's going to vary by the state, Joy, and there are going to be record numbers of provisional ballots cast in this election, in large part because a lot of voters who requested mail ballots, all of a sudden they have real questions about the reliability and security of the mail and getting their ballot in on time. So a number of them are going to decide in person, and depending on the state, you have to sign an affidavit when you get to the polls and cast a provisional ballot to ensure so that there is a safeguard in place that no one is voting twice. And of course, the counties or municipalities in charge of elections have to process those, and they take longer to process provisionals afterwards, and in some cases adjudicate them to make sure that the voter is eligible to vote, especially in situations where a voter has moved recently, but the registration is not updated. We're bound to see large numbers, larger than usual numbers of rejected ballots, because voters are not accustomed to how to correctly cast a mail ballot in some cases. Consider, as Rachel pointed out earlier, in Pennsylvania, it's only been in the mid-single digits, the percentage of all voters who have voted by mail before. In North Carolina, it's also been in the low single digits. So we are bound to see rejection rates that could lead to hundreds of thousands of votes that were cast being rejected on technicalities.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.